The American Revolution, while a noble fight for freedom, ultimately was stirred on by economic concerns. So when the young nation was creating her founding documents, a looming shadow began to peer around the corner. This, of course, was the slavery institution. By the time of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, the world was still heavily invested in the institution of slavery, with only a few Western nations beginning to take steps to dismantle it. The Atlantic slave trade actually reached its peak around this year, with a majority of enslaved individuals bound for Brazil and the Caribbean, but not all of them. Still, a notable portion were being brought into southern states. And for many of the founding fathers, particularly those from southern and rural states where slavery was economically significant, the question of slavery was deeply intertwined with politics. Indeed, the Revolutionary War had been in part driven by economic grievances. This was a nation willing to fight tooth and nail over economic and political fairness. So, what happens when a topic such as slavery begins to enter the conversation? Join me today as we delve into some of the debates, decisions, and compromises that the Founding Fathers went through trying to navigate slavery and how it intertwines with other conversations happening in the young nation. Sit back and enjoy.
Get on a raft with Taft, boys, get on the winning boat. The man worthwhile with a friendly smile will get the honest vote. He'll save the country sure, boys, from Bryanhurst and Graft.
Slavery would make its debut in the convention early on, first appearing July 11th, just a few days into the discussion on how the legislative branch should set up. Roger Sherman of Connecticut started that day by thinking that perhaps two branches, one being each state has a vote, and another perhaps being portioned on the idea of free inhabitants, would be a good idea. After a small round of discussions, John Rutledge of South Carolina and Pierce Butler of South Carolina added a motion to include slaves in a 1-to-1 ratio of free men for the purpose of the proportioned branch. James Wilson of Pennsylvania, who is considered the founding father of the Three-Fifths Compromise, and Charles Pinckney of South Carolina actually countered, offering what we now know as the Three-Fifths Compromise. Now, the question that may pop to your mind is, why did two northern delegates reject the 1-to-1 count? Well, simply most northern states, somewhat correct, assumed that southern delegates who wanted a 1-to-1 ratio simply were playing politics. They assumed that those delegates in those states would never give slaves any rights and saw a way to help to tip the scales of power in their favor. Not all of the southern delegates acted like this, and much of the northerners considered the Three-Fifths Compromise as actually legitimizing slavery and thought they shouldn't legitimize it at all, and they were often personally against the Three-Fifths Compromise. Eldridge Gerry of Massachusetts would actually pipe up, thinking it was ridiculous that blacks who were considered property in the South would be given representation, and I quote, being on par with cattle and horses in the North. But most of the northern representatives and the northern-southern representatives, Virginia, North Carolina, generally, they knew that if they banned slavery, the southern states would never ratify, and the northern states would never agree to the 1-to-1 count. And so, at this date, everyone thought that it was more important to implement the Constitution for the nation's health rather than deal with the topic of slavery. So, at the end of the discussion, in a 9-to-2 vote, the first iterations of the Three-Fifths Compromise would be voted in the affirmative, with only the states of New Jersey and Delaware voting against this. This was actually a very short part of the day, and slavery itself was casted away as a, quote, settled issue, as the topic of slavery would not pop up again until about 19 days later. The slavery topic re-debuted on June 30th during discussions surrounding the formation of the legislative branch, once again during the Constitutional Convention. James Madison of New York advocated for a previously discussed two-branch system to Oliver Ellsworth of Connecticut, and, of course, to the rest of the convention, but he had new arguments to back it up. These past 19 days were full of heated and bitter arguments between what most of the convention goers assumed was the obvious battle line, that of which small and large states faced off of each other. Madison, on the other hand, highlighted what he thought were the more important crucial distinction in the states, that the divide among states wasn't simply based on size, as many others were operating on, but rather on the presence or absence of slavery. Madison argued that for the legislative branch to effectively represent all states, it must account for this fundamental division. He proposed a solution similar to that of Sherman 19 days ago, where he suggested that one branch be allocated proportionally based on the number of free men in each state, while the other branch would incorporate both free men and three-fifths of the slave population. A novel idea that would have led to a pretty even lower branch and a northern-dominated upper branch. Here, I actually have graphics on a hypothetical makeup of the representatives between these two branches using the 1790 census. In this suggested legislative, the upper branch would be based on only the number of free men. This would be a northern-dominated branch as represented by the blue dots. Of the 96 seats, assuming one representative for every 33,000 free men, which was the ratio of the 1790 Congress, northern states would have 57 seats or 60% of the chamber, a little bit over 60% of the chamber. You can see the concern for southern states in this scenario. They could easily have their interests being overridden by northern interests. Now let's look at the lower branch under this proposal, in which there would be 108 seats. Unlike the first branch, Northerners would have a slim majority of only 6 seats, which, while still a Northern advantage, could easily give the Southern states a chance to fight back. For example, techniques like the modern-day Senate filibuster require 60% of the chamber to agree to move forward, something that would be impossible for Southern states in the upper branch due to the North having over 60% of the chamber. However, in this lower branch, with the additional 13 slave population seats, they could realistically stall legislation. Despite the novelty of Madison's proposal, subsequent discussions largely overlooked it. Instead, attention shifted towards the idea of one branch representing all the states equally and the other one based just on population size. Slavery thus faded into the background until July 11th, when it reemerged as a central topic that day.
Get on a raft with Taft, boys, get on the winning boat. The man worth
July 11th began with discussions on how frequently the nation should update the number of congressmen, with the possibility of an annual update being briefly considered. However, the talks were swiftly diverted when the contentious issue of how slaves should be counted in the census came up. It had been nearly a month to the day in which the states had agreed to a three-fifths compromise idea, but the past month of arguing had convinced multiple Southern state representatives to once again try and argue for a 1-to-1 ratio. Pierce Butler and General Charles Pinckney, both representing South Carolina, now argued vehemently that slaves should be counted equally with free whites for the purpose of determining congressional representation. Using a bit more graphics, and once more using the 1790 census, if slaves were counted 1-to-1 equally to a free man, hypothetically, the southern states would have a 2-seat majority in Congress at the time and gained a whopping 20 seats from the slave population and an additional 7 seats from comparing it to a three-fifths compromise. Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts disagreed. He suggested that even three-fifths representation for slaves was too much power to southern slave states. Nathaniel Gorham of Massachusetts countered Gary's argument by pointing out that if three-fifths representation was acceptable for taxation, it should probably also be acceptable for representation. This is when George Mason of Virginia expressed reluctance to support the motion made by Butler and Pinckney. He acknowledged that there would be significant political benefits of counting slaves equally, but he maintained that it would be unjust, that he and his state had already agreed to the compromise. Butler would counter this by saying that the labor of a slave and a free man were identical, then the representation should be equal. He did kind of sidestep how slaves were being counted for tax purposes. Hugh Williamson, who in my reading was a rather quiet man of North Carolina, echoed similar sentiments to Mason. He emphasized the need for consistency between representation and taxation, and ultimately, the first motion to consider blacks as equal to whites for the purpose of representation failed 3-7, with New York abstaining. You had Northern members who were anti-equal representation for fear of too much Southern power, such as Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts. You had pro-3/5 compromise Northern members who typically disagreed with the principle and wanted equality, but had to compromise, such as Nathaniel Gorham. And many of those who could not in good conscience vote to have slaves below free men opposed the 3/5 compromise until it was 1-to-1 ratio, such as Governor Morris of New York. As for Southern members, you had pro-3/5 compromise members who typically did it out of compromise and for lower taxation, such as George Mason of Virginia. But a couple Deep South states were pro-equal representation, in quotes, not for equality purposes, but rather for political reasoning, such as Pierce Butler. And as we can see, this is how Congress would shape up. Southern states would have the majority in this scenario. While I have no source for what I'm about to say, perhaps having more congressmen and thus more power in the political branch of Congress, which controlled taxation, would have been their strategy to kind of circumvent the 1-to-1 taxation on slaves. That would probably have to go along with 1-to-1 representation. So ultimately, the 3/5 compromise, it's kind of weird. A lot of northern states wanted equality for slaves and no slavery, but they didn't want to give them representation as slaves because a lot of them feared that it was legitimizing slavery. But they knew they had to agree to a compromise, otherwise southern states would never agree to this. Like I said earlier, Governor Morris could not agree to such a compromise. He wanted equality between them and like true freedom and true liberation of the slaves. Subsequently, the discussion shifted to whether slaves should be counted as 3/5 of a person in terms of just a census, which had yet to be determined as the means for determining the number of congressmen. Rufus King of Massachusetts opposed the idea, fearing it would cause discontent among states without slaves, but he also, in the following breath, stated he would vote neutral on the matter either way. Roger Sherman of Connecticut acknowledged the injustice in the 3/5 compromise in this scenario as well, but he pledged support due to prevailing circumstances. James Wilson of Pennsylvania expressed confusion over the compromise, questioning whether slaves were being counted as citizens or property in general. He also did fear that his home state of Pennsylvania would be greatly upset if slaves were being counted at all, but despite his reservations, he once again endorsed the compromise for the sake of unity. It would be Governor Morris of New York who vehemently opposed the compromise, arguing that it perpetuated the slave trade, which he vehemently opposed. Consequently, the motion to include 3/5 of blacks in the census actually failed 4-6. The remaining discussions of the day revolved around how frequent the census would be.
Get on a raft with Taft, boys, get on the winning boat. The man worth.
As a constitutional convention reconvened on July 12th, Mr. Governor Morris of New York wasted no time in proposing that taxation be directly proportional to representation and thus population. However, the conversation swiftly circled back to the contentious issue of slavery, with Mr. Butler of South Carolina brought the topic back up in trying to argue that blacks should be counted as equal for free whites for both representation and taxation this time. He also did agree that Mr. Morris's motion for taxation to be represented to direct to representation was a good idea. The debate continued, and after some discussion, direct taxation seemed like it would be abused by the legislation or lead to more armed rebellions. Governor Morris of New York suggested that perhaps taxing imports and exports would better suit the young nation, as both were a general indication of population as well. This is when General Charles Pinckney stood up and agreed with this idea, but he did echo concerns about fairness for Southern states, saying, and I quote, Southern Carolina has in 1 year exported to the amount of 600,000 sterling, all of which was the fruit of the labor of her blacks. Will she be represented in proportion to this amount? She will not. Neither ought she then be subject to a tax of it. End quote. So essentially here, General Charles Pinckney was basically bringing back no taxation without representation in a kind of weird and twisted way. Here he was worried that export-import taxes were a good idea and would eventually be how the nation would fund itself for a couple centuries, basically. But he argued that because the state would be taxed on the export and the imports produced by her slaves, that them not getting the one-to-one representation was robbery. It was taxation without representation to him. However, multiple people would talk about this in the Constitutional Convention, and several others approved of the idea of export and import taxes, but they ultimately kind of agreed to a direct taxation system, which would eventually be walked back and everything. William Davie of North Carolina emphasized the importance of fair representation for slave states in any confederation, stating that if their needs were not met, that the southern states would never agree to join the Union. This is when William Johnson of Connecticut thought that perhaps wealth and population were one and the same in terms of taxation, thus blacks should be equal to whites for the purposes of taxation and representation. This is when Edmund Randolph of Virginia then proposed a motion for a regular census as well, with blacks valued at 3/5 of their numbers. As we can see, they began kind of dealing with the slavery issue as soon as it was brought back up. Oliver Ellsworth of Connecticut supported Randolph's motion, although General Pinckney attempted to amend it to grant equal one-to-one representation, but that failed. The final vote of the day saw the proposition of proportioning representation to direct taxation, with 3/5 of the black population being considered, along with a census in 6 years after this meeting, and then every 10 years thereafter, which is where we get our modern every 10-year census option. The measure passed with support with both northern and southern states, albeit with some divided opinions among the states themselves. On July 13th, the Constitutional Convention engaged in its final substantive discussion about slavery before the August break, culminating in a heated exchange between Governor Morris of New York and James Wilson of Pennsylvania. The conversation actually began with Edmund Randolph of Virginia proposing a motion to remove wealth as a determinant of representation, advocating for a focus solely on population, with new states being represented on their population alone. This is when Morris vehemently opposed this motion, labeling it as absurdly inconsistent. He argued that either blacks counted as a person and get full representation, or, alternatively, if blacks were not considered inhabitants, but rather 3/5 of a person, then they were akin to property, in which case, when determining representation, wealth should be a factor. Expressing newfound concern growing between northern and southern states, Morris feared actually that the South might gain a majority of power and potentially instigate conflict with Spain over the Florida and Mississippi territories to further bolster their influence. He questioned what defenses would the northern states have in such a scenario. He also then began to warn the convention that allowing every single special interest, such as the southern states and slavery, to demand a special security would lead to endless conflicts, both internally and externally. In response, James Wilson of Pennsylvania reiterated the fundamental belief in equality, and he predicted that certain states would inevitably hold a majority of the population over time. But he cautioned that we cannot succumb to jealousy amongst the states, particularly regarding future conflicts between interior and coastal states, which would lead to consequences reminiscent of those under British rule. Wilson then began defending the use of population as a basis of representation. He highlighted the failures of all the previous discussions that had considered wealth, and he acknowledged the hypocrisy and the imperfection of the three-fifths compromise, but asserted it to Mr. Morris that it was the best solution achieved through consensus. Ultimately, the slavery debate concluded as the states voted overwhelmingly with 9 in favor and 1 absence to strike out wealth as a determinant of representation. So, on this particular argument, Morris was very upset that there was such a fundamental hypocrisy happening in the states, and he was worried that, and I'm sure you can tell throughout this video that Morris had spoken up multiple times, that he really did fear southern states gaining too much power and dragging northern states kind of for a ride. He basically meant every time slavery came up, he thought southern states had too much power. And he also did correctly warn that every special interest that will get special securities will lead to conflict. And slavery was one of the only special interests that truly got special securities in the Constitution, and that's what led to, Civil War and whatnot. James Wilson reiterated that he knew that the Three-Fifths Compromise was flawed. It was hypocritical. It was not very fair to a lot of people, but he believed that with the crumbling Articles of Confederation, it would be more important for the nation to worry about getting a constitution out and ratified rather than waiting for the ticking time bomb that was the Articles of Confederation. And I wanted to point out that he was also worried. While a lot of people saw the fight between northern and southern states, which had actually become the predominant view rather than big and small states, he was more worried about interior states and coastal states, which is interesting, as he saw that the coastal elite would end up ruling the interior states as puppets who could never quite get the population or whatever. And he also warned that jealousy between states would be very, very bad for the nation. And the states had to begin thinking not for themselves per se, but rather for the nation as a whole.
Get on a raft with Taft, boys, get on the winning boat.
The slave debate at the Constitutional Convention was far from resolved, actually. Although slavery would not be mentioned again until after the August break, its reemergence was more contentious than ever. The initial compromise of counting slaves as 3/5 of a person had been agreed upon early in the convention, yet as heated discussions continued, particularly during the Great Compromise, some southern state representatives attempted to gain political influence without paying the price truly. The inconsistent handling of slaves would upset several northern members, yet at the end of it all, compromise was found. A fair chunk of the convention operated in good faith and had agreed to something. The conversation was far from done, as post-August break, the convention would implement a lot of special securities for a special interest of slavery, which harks back to what Governor Morris of New York warned about. He warned that placating these special interests would be a recipe of disaster. While one may obviously disagree with the institution of slavery, the situation was dire for the young nation. The Articles of Confederation were woefully underprepared to guide the nation much longer, and so compromise and getting the nation fixed was the top priority. Many Northern members felt this way and tried their best for the good of the nation to look past slavery. Perhaps these discussions served more of a warning to the nation that letting this pot simmer would end in disaster sooner rather than later. Thank you all for watching. I'm glad you guys stuck around for the episode. I had a lot of fun making this, actually. Trying out some new graphic stuff. Please let me know what you think below. Share this with people. Like, subscribe. You can catch me at my socials on screen. And until next time, have a wonderful day.